I need to tell someone what happened in the signals room before they classify it all away, before the ISB scrubs the logs and reassigns everyone who heard it, before I forget the sound of my own name. My designation was Communications Specialist 3rd Class Varentalde, Imperial Navy, assigned to the ISD Relentless Outer Rim Patrol Fleet. I'm recording this on a data cylinder that isn't logged in any inventory system, using equipment that officially doesn't exist, in a maintenance shaft that the deck plans show as solid bulkhead. I have maybe 6 hours before my shift supervisor notices the gap in my duty log. I have maybe 3 days before the thing I heard finishes whatever it started inside my head. They never tell you in the academy that sound can be a contagion. They teach you signal protocol, encryption theory, communication network architecture. They teach you how to route a fleet coordination package through 17 relay points without losing synchronization. They teach you Imperial communications doctrine, which is mostly about maintaining information hierarchy and reporting irregularities up the chain of command without asking questions. What they don't teach you is what to do when you intercept something that shouldn't exist, from a source that isn't on any Imperial registry, using a carrier frequency that violates 3 separate laws of physics as we understand them. It started 4 months ago, though I think it had been building for longer than that. The Relentless was on a standard patrol sweep through the Atravis sector, which is the kind of assignment that sounds important in the duty roster, but actually means you're babysitting empty space and checking in on minor outposts that haven't seen a rebel operative in 5 years. The sector is mostly dead systems, failed colonies, and asteroid fields that aren't worth mining. We'd been out there for 9 months with nothing but the occasional smuggler intercept to break the monotony. The crew was bored, discipline was getting slack, and the officers were inventing make-work to keep everyone busy. That's when Lieutenant Corinth decided to run a full-spectrum communications diagnostic. I was on the Gamma shift, which meant I had the signals room mostly to myself, except for Ensign Delic on the monitoring station and a maintenance droid that came through every few hours to check the cooling systems. The signals room on an Imperial-class Star Destroyer is smaller than you'd think, considering it's the nexus for all communications across a vessel that carries over 37,000 personnel. It's buried deep in the superstructure, surrounded by sensor arrays and computer cores, insulated from the rest of the ship by layers of redundant systems and backup networks. The walls are covered in status displays showing data throughput across hundreds of channels. The air smells like ozone and heated circuits. The lighting is the same red-tinged dimness you get in all the technical spaces, easy on the eyes during long shifts, but somehow making everything feel slightly unreal, slightly disconnected from the rest of the ship. The diagnostic Lieutenant Corinth ordered was excessive even by Navy standards. We were supposed to sweep every frequency band the ship's communications array could receive, log all detected signals, cross-reference them against known Imperial channels, and identify any anomalies. It was the kind of task that would take 15 hours and produce a report that no one would read, but it kept us busy and let the lieutenant claim he was maintaining operational readiness. I initialized the sweep protocol at 200 hours and settled in to watch the displays cycle through frequency bands, while the system automatically logged and categorized everything it detected. For the first 6 hours, it was exactly as boring as expected. The system picked up our own ship's internal communications, the standard Imperial military channels, background radiation from the local star, and the usual static of empty space. Ensign Delic fell asleep at his station around 0400. The maintenance droid came through twice, its servos whining in the quiet. I was drinking my 4th cup of recaf and thinking about putting in for a transfer to somewhere with actual gravity variance when the system flagged an anomaly on a frequency that shouldn't have existed. The readout said it was detecting a signal at 2.7 exahertz, which was immediately wrong. Our equipment maxes out at 1.9 exahertz. Anything beyond that enters ranges where the electromagnetic spectrum starts doing things that require a doctorate in theoretical physics to explain. I checked the diagnostics, thinking it was a sensor malfunction or maybe interference from one of the computer cores. All systems showed green. The signal was real, or at least the equipment thought it was real. It was faint, barely above the noise floor, but it was there and it was modulated, which meant it was carrying information. I should have logged it and flagged it for review by the sensor analysis team. That's what the protocol said. That's what my training said. But I'd been staring at status displays for 6 hours, and I was bored and curious. And the thing about working in Imperial communications is that 99% of what you handle is mundane logistics chatter, and the other 1% is classified above your clearance level, so you never get to know what anything actually means. Here was something strange, something unexplained, something that the procedures didn't cover. I routed it to my personal monitoring station and told the system to boost the signal and try to demodulate it. The sound that came through my headset wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't static or interference. It wasn't a voice or a data burst. It was almost musical but wrong, like hearing a song played on instruments that don't exist. There were tones that seemed to harmonize with themselves, frequencies that my ears interpreted as sound but my brain couldn't process as coming from any specific source. And underneath it all, barely audible, there was a rhythm. Not a regular pulse like a beacon or a timing signal. Something irregular, something that almost sounded organic, like breathing or a heartbeat, but slower, deeper, coming from somewhere far away. I listened to it for maybe 30 seconds before I started feeling wrong. It's hard to describe. It wasn't nausea or dizziness exactly. It was more like suddenly becoming aware of the weight of the ship around me, the mass of the hull and the decks and the thousands of personnel, all of it pressing down through space that was itself pressing back. I became aware of the distance we were from anything else, the light years of emptiness in every direction, the fact that the Relentless was just a tiny bubble of air and metal and human life surrounded by an infinite nothing that would kill everyone aboard in seconds if the hull breached. The red-lit displays seemed darker. The hum of the equipment seemed louder. The smell of ozone seemed sharper, almost acrid, like something burning. I pulled the headset off and the feeling faded, but slowly, like waking up from a dream where the emotions linger even after the images disappear. Ensign Delic was still asleep at his station, which meant the sound hadn't come through the room's speakers, only through my headset. The displays showed the signal was still there, still being received, still modulated in that strange pattern. I looked at the frequency readout again. 2.7 exahertz. I looked at the directional data, which showed where in space the signal was coming from. The system had calculated a bearing, but it was marked with error flags. The signal wasn't coming from any fixed point. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, from a location the computers couldn't resolve. I should have stopped there. I should have logged it as an equipment malfunction and gone back to the standard diagnostic, but I didn't, because there was something about that sound that made me want to hear it again, that made me need to understand what it was. I've thought about that a lot in the months since, about whether that impulse came from me or from the signal itself, whether hearing it even once was enough to start the process. The ISB psych evaluator I talked to later, before they classified everything and sent me to the medical wing, said that auditory patterns can have neurological effects, that certain combinations of frequencies can trigger responses in the human brain, that it was understandable I'd react the way I did. But she was lying. I could see it in her eyes. She'd read something in my file that scared her, and she was trying to make it sound normal and explicable when we both knew it wasn't. I put the headset back on and listened again. This time I paid attention to the pattern, trying to analyze it the way I'd been trained, trying to break it down into components I could understand. The tones seemed to cycle through a sequence, each one lasting a few seconds before shifting to the next. There were 7 distinct tones, or maybe 8, or maybe 9. It was hard to count them because they seemed to overlap in ways that sound shouldn't be able to overlap, creating harmonics that filled in the spaces between. And that rhythm underneath, that slow pulse, seemed to be getting clearer, more defined. It didn't sound mechanical. It sounded alive. It sounded like something breathing in the dark between stars. I started recording it. The system logs would show that later, when the ISB went through everything. I captured 17 minutes of the signal before it faded below the detection threshold and disappeared. I ran it through every analysis tool I had access to. Spectral analysis, pattern recognition, linguistic algorithms in case it was some kind of language. Everything came back inconclusive. The signal had structure, but it was structure that didn't match any known communication protocol. It had information density, but it was encoding something that our systems couldn't decode. It had that rhythm, that pulse that kept making me think of breathing, of something vast and patient and very far away. I didn't sleep well that day. I went off shift at 0800 and headed to my quarters, which I shared with 3 other communications specialists in a cabin barely large enough for the bunks and lockers. I lay in my bunk, staring at the underside of the bunk above me, listening to Specialist Gren snoring and Specialist Voda muttering in her sleep, and I kept hearing that sound in my head. Not a memory of it, the actual sound, faint but present, like it was still being transmitted directly into my auditory cortex. I could hear the tones cycling through their sequence. I could hear that deep pulse underneath. And I started to notice something I hadn't caught during the recording. There were words in it. Not words I understood, not even words in any language I recognized, but definitely words, definite syllables arranged in definite sequences, rising and falling with the tones. I got up after an hour of not sleeping and went to the crew mess, thinking food and activity might help. The mess on Gamma shift changeover was crowded, full of off-duty personnel grabbing breakfast before sleep and on-duty personnel grabbing stimcaf before their shifts. I got a tray of reconstituted protein and overcooked grains from the dispenser and found a seat in the corner, away from the conversation and the noise. I was eating without tasting anything, still hearing that sound, when Lieutenant Corinth came through on some errand and stopped at my table. He asked if the diagnostic had turned up anything interesting. I hesitated, and in that hesitation I made a decision I still don't fully understand. I told him it was all routine, nothing anomalous, sweep complete and logged. He nodded and moved on. I'd just lied to a superior officer about an unexplained signal detected during an official diagnostic, which was a violation of about 6 different regulations. I told myself I'd go back and log it properly once I understood what it was, once I had something coherent to report. But that was a lie too. The truth was that I didn't want to share it. The truth was that the signal felt like mine, like it had been meant for me specifically, and the thought of other people analyzing it and picking it apart and filing it away in some classified database made something in my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't name. I went back on shift that night and checked the monitoring logs from the day shift. No one else had detected the signal. I ran a passive scan on the same frequency band and found nothing. It was gone, or dormant, or maybe it had never been there at all except in the recording I'd made. I copied that recording to a personal data cylinder, which was another violation, and then I did something I really can't explain. I erased the original from the official logs. I went into the diagnostic records and removed the anomaly flag. I made it look like the sweep had been completely clean, nothing unusual, just empty space and background radiation. It took me 20 minutes and required access codes I wasn't supposed to have, but had learned from watching the senior technicians. When I was done, there was no official record that the signal had ever been detected. I told myself I'd undo it later. I told myself I just needed time to analyze it privately, to figure out what it was before filing a report. I told myself a lot of things that night. What I didn't tell myself was the truth, which was that I was already compromised, that hearing the signal had changed something in me, that I was protecting it the way you'd protect a secret you're afraid of losing. The next few weeks were normal, or seemed normal. I pulled my shifts in the signals room, monitored the routine communications traffic, filed the standard reports. I was careful not to run any more diagnostics on that frequency range. I was careful not to mention it to anyone. At night, in my bunk, I'd listen to the recording through a personal earpiece, the volume low enough that my bunkmates couldn't hear. I'd lie there in the dark, listening to those tones cycle through their sequence, listening to that pulse that sounded like breathing, listening to those almost words that I still couldn't understand. And every time I listened, I heard more layers in the sound, more complexity in the pattern, more meaning in those syllables that weren't quite a language. I started having dreams about it, not normal dreams, dreams that felt more like transmissions, like someone or something was broadcasting directly into my sleeping mind. I'd dream I was floating in space, surrounded by darkness that wasn't empty but full, thick with presence, and I'd hear the signal coming from everywhere at once, so loud it vibrated through my body, and I'd understand it, fully and completely, and the understanding was so vast and terrible that I'd wake up gasping, my heart pounding, unable to remember what I'd known, but feeling the shape of it like a scar in my mind. Specialist Voda noticed I wasn't sleeping well. She asked if I was okay, if I needed to see the med bay. I told her I was fine, just insomnia, standard for long deployments. She looked at me with something like concern and said I should at least get some sleep aids from the ship's pharmacist. I thanked her and didn't do it. I didn't want anything that might interfere with the dreams, because despite how they terrified me, I also craved them. I wanted to understand what the signal was saying. I wanted to know what that presence in the darkness was. I wanted to be chosen again the way I'd been chosen that first night when the signal came through my headset and no one else's. About a month after I first detected the signal, we received new orders. The Relentless was being reassigned to a deep space patrol route that would take us further into the Atravis sector, out past the last surveyed systems, into regions that were on the charts as nothing but reference coordinates and gravitational data. It was an unusual assignment. Star destroyers don't normally waste fuel on empty space patrols. We were capital ships, meant for system control and fleet operations. Not surveying uninhabited stellar regions, but the orders came from Sector Command with an Admiralty authorization code, which meant someone important wanted us out there, and no one was going to question why. The crew didn't like it. There was grumbling in the mess halls and the rec areas. Deep space patrols meant months without port call, without fresh supplies, without any break in the routine. It meant long duty shifts staring at sensors that showed nothing but empty space. It meant isolation from the rest of the fleet, from the rest of the Navy, from anything that made you feel like you were part of something larger than one ship moving through darkness. But grumbling didn't change orders. We made the jump to hyperspace and headed out into the nothing, and I felt something in my chest loosen, like a breath I'd been holding without knowing it. We were going toward it. We were going toward the source. I didn't know that consciously, not yet. I told myself it was just satisfaction at getting away from the monotony of standard patrol routes. But looking back, I can see I was already beginning to understand things I shouldn't have been able to understand, to know things without knowing how I knew them. The signal had done something to me. It had opened something, or activated something, or created a channel where none had existed before. And now, as we traveled deeper into that empty region of space, the channel was getting wider. The signal came back 3 days into the new patrol route. I was on shift again, gamma cycle again, the signals room quiet except for the background hum of the equipment. We were crossing through a stellar void, a region where the stars were so sparse that looking out the viewport, if there had been any viewports in the signals room, would have shown mostly darkness. The sensors showed nothing in our vicinity. No planets, no asteroids, no ships, no stations, just empty space and the distant radiation of faraway stars. I was monitoring the standard channels, watching the routine traffic between the Relentless and the rest of the patrol fleet, when the system flagged an anomaly on a frequency that I recognized immediately, even though I'd been trying not to think about it for the past month. 2.7 exahertz. Same frequency, stronger this time, well above the noise floor, clear and distinct. My hands were shaking as I routed it to my monitoring station. I looked around the signals room. Ensign Delic wasn't there that night. They'd rotated him to day shift. It was just me and a different maintenance droid, and the distant sound of someone's boots on the deck above. I put the headset on and listened. The signal was the same, but more. The tones were clearer, more defined. The rhythm was stronger, more present. And the words, because they were definitely words now, I could hear them distinctly, were forming patterns that my brain was starting to recognize as syntax, as grammar, as the structure of meaning, even if I didn't understand the meaning itself. I sat there listening, and I felt something inside my head shifting, like a gear catching, like a lock opening. The words started to sound familiar, not because I'd heard them before, but because I was remembering them, pulling them up from some place in my mind that shouldn't have existed. I don't know how long I listened. The shift logs say it was 43 minutes before I spoke to anyone, but it felt like both longer and shorter than that, like time was doing something strange while I was connected to the signal. What I remember is that I started understanding it. Not completely, not all at once, but in fragments, in impressions, in feelings that coalesced into concepts. The signal was a message. It was a message that had been transmitting for a very long time. It was a message from something that existed in a place where space and time worked differently than they did in our universe. Something that was trying to communicate across a boundary that wasn't meant to be crossed. And the message was an invitation. I took the headset off and sat there staring at the displays, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the equipment hum. The signal was still showing on the readouts, still being received, still pulsing with that slow rhythm that I now recognized as something counting down, marking intervals, measuring distance. Distance to what? Distance to arrival, distance to intersection. The terms forming in my mind didn't come from my training or my experience. They came from the signal itself, from whatever it was teaching me just by being heard. I needed to tell someone. I needed to report this. It was clearly something significant, something that required analysis by people with more expertise than a communications specialist third class. But even as I thought that, I knew I wasn't going to do it. The signal was mine. It had chosen me. Reporting it would mean losing it, would mean watching it disappear into the classified infrastructure of Imperial intelligence, would mean never knowing what it was or what it wanted. So instead of reporting it, I recorded it again. I captured 2 hours of signal before it faded. I copied it to my personal storage. I erased the anomaly from the official logs. And I went off shift feeling like I'd betrayed something important, but unable to articulate what or why. The dreams got worse after that. Or better, depending on how you measure such things. They became more vivid, more coherent. I'd dream I was in the signals room, but it wasn't the signals room on the Relentless. It was the signals room on a different ship, or maybe the same ship but in a different time. Or maybe not a ship at all, but something my dreaming mind was interpreting as a ship, because it didn't have the concepts to understand what it actually was. And I'd hear the signal, but I'd hear it fully, completely, without any of the static or interference of normal transmission. I'd understand every word, every tone, every layer of meaning, and the words would tell me things. They'd tell me that the universe I knew was smaller than I thought, that the space between stars wasn't empty, that there were intelligences older than the Republic and the Empire combined, living in the dark places where light never reached. They'd tell me that sound could travel through dimensions, that certain frequencies could pierce the barriers between realities, that what we called communication was just the surface level of something deeper and stranger. They'd tell me that I'd been selected, that my hearing the signal wasn't an accident, that there were qualities in my mind, configurations of neurons perhaps, or patterns of thought that made me receptive to what was being transmitted. They'd tell me that I was becoming a bridge, a translator, a conduit between the source and the destination. And when I'd wake up, I wouldn't be able to remember the words exactly, but I'd remember the feelings they produced. Awe and terror in equal measure, the sense of being seen by something vast, the sense of being changed by that seeing, the sense of being used for a purpose I didn't understand but couldn't resist. I started making mistakes at work, small things at first, delayed responses to communications queries, errors in routing protocols. Once I fell asleep at my station and woke up to find Ensign Delic shaking my shoulder, concern and irritation mixed on his face. Lieutenant Corinth called me in for a performance review and asked if everything was all right, if there were any personal issues affecting my duties. I assured him I was fine, just tired, adjusting poorly to the Deep Space Patrol schedule. He accepted that, but noted it in my file, which meant Command was now aware there was something wrong, even if they didn't know what. The other communications specialists started avoiding me, not obviously, not in ways I could point to and complain about, but I noticed it. The conversations that would stop when I entered the mess, the shift swaps that ensured I was working alone more often than not, the way Specialist Voda, who'd been friendly before, now kept her distance and wouldn't meet my eyes. They could sense something was wrong with me. People can always sense that, even if they can't articulate what they're sensing. I was changing, and they knew it, and their instinct was to pull away from the change in case it was contagious. They were right to do that. It was contagious. The signal was a contagion, and I was the initial vector, and what I should have done was report myself to medical and let them quarantine me before it spread. But I didn't, because by that point I didn't want to stop it. I wanted it to continue. I wanted to understand what it was teaching me. I wanted to become whatever it was making me into. The third time the signal appeared was different. We were deeper into the stellar void, 5 weeks into the patrol route, and the Relentless was alone. The rest of our patrol group had been reassigned to investigate some minor incident in an adjacent sector, which meant we were the only Imperial vessel within several light years. The isolation felt deliberate, though I couldn't have explained why. I was on shift, monitoring the standard channels, when the signal came through again. Same frequency, but this time it was strong enough to bleed through into the room's speakers, even though I hadn't routed it there. The other 2 personnel in the signals room that night, Ensign Delic and a new technician I didn't know well, heard it too. Ensign Delic looked up from his station, confusion on his face. "What is that?" he asked. The new technician was already checking his displays, trying to source the transmission. I should have said something. I should have helped them. I should have admitted what I knew, but I didn't. I just sat there listening as the signal filled the room, louder than it had been in my headset, louder than it should have been possible for our speakers to reproduce, and I watched my colleagues' faces as they heard what I'd been hearing for the past 2 months. The ensign went pale. The technicians started to shake. They were hearing it for the first time, without preparation, without the gradual acclimation I'd undergone, and it was hitting them all at once. The wrongness of it, the alienness, the sense of something vast and cold and utterly inhuman trying to communicate across an impossible distance. Ensign Delic pulled his headset off and stumbled out of his chair, backing away from his station like it was something dangerous. The technician just sat frozen, staring at his displays, his mouth moving without sound. The signal lasted for 6 minutes. When it faded, the silence in the signals room was absolute. No one spoke. No one moved. The equipment hummed. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something organic and wrong, like decay or like the sterile emptiness of space somehow leaking through the hull. Finally, Ensign Delic said, "We need to report this. We need to tell the lieutenant." His voice was shaking. The technician just nodded, still staring at his displays. I said, "No." They both looked at me. I could see the fear in their eyes, but I could also see something else. Curiosity. The same curiosity I'd felt the first time I heard it. The signal was already working on them, already opening channels, already beginning the process of change. I said, "We need to understand it first. We need to analyze it before we report it. Otherwise, we're just passing along noise." That was a lie. It wasn't noise. But they wanted to believe it, wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, wanted to believe they hadn't just heard something that shouldn't exist. Ensign Delic looked uncertain. The technician said, "We should at least log it." I agreed with that, knowing I could erase the logs later, and that seemed to satisfy them. We spent the rest of the shift in silence, each of us alone with what we'd heard, each of us beginning the process I'd started 2 months earlier. I'd infected them. The signal had infected them through me, and I felt no guilt about it, only a strange satisfaction, like I'd completed some task I'd been assigned without knowing it. The next day, Ensign Delic didn't show up for his shift. The day after that, the technician, his name was Corin, I learned, reported to the medbay with complaints of insomnia and auditory hallucinations. They kept him there for observation. I visited him once during my off hours, standing in the corridor outside the medbay, where I could see through the transparistile into the observation room. He was lying on a bunk, staring at the ceiling, his lips moving like he was speaking or maybe singing. I knew what he was hearing, the signal echoing in his mind, teaching him words in a language that didn't exist in our reality. He looked peaceful despite everything. He looked like I felt. They released him after 3 days, declaring it a stress reaction to long deployment. They gave him sedatives and assigned him to lighter duties, but I saw him in the corridors sometimes, and I could tell the sedatives weren't working. He was still hearing it. We'd make eye contact and there would be a moment of recognition, of shared understanding, and then we'd both look away and continue on as if nothing had passed between us. We never spoke about it. We didn't need to. The signal connected us in ways that didn't require speech. Ensign Delic was different. He tried to fight it. He went to Lieutenant Corinth and filed a report about detecting an anomalous signal. I don't know exactly what he said because the lieutenant never discussed it with me, but I heard later from other crew members that Delic had been referred to the ship's counselor for anxiety and possible paranoid ideation. The counselor recommended rest and monitoring. Delic became increasingly insistent that something was wrong with the ship's communications array, that we were receiving transmissions from an unauthorized source, that the transmissions were affecting personnel. The counselor's diagnosis changed to acute stress disorder. They reassigned him out of communications entirely and put him on recreational duty rotation. I saw him once in the mess hall, and he looked at me with something like hatred and something like pleading, and I understood that he knew I'd lied about the signal, that he knew I'd hidden evidence, that he blamed me for what was happening to him. He was right to blame me. But he was also fighting something that couldn't be fought, and the fighting was destroying him faster than surrender would have. 3 weeks later, Ensign Delic walked out an airlock. No suit, no warning. Just opened the outer door during a routine maintenance cycle and stepped into space. The official report said it was suicide brought on by acute psychological distress related to long deployment isolation. There was an inquiry. The ship's counselor was reprimanded for inadequate intervention. Lieutenant Corinth instituted new mental health monitoring protocols for all personnel. And I said nothing because what could I say? That Delic had heard something that broke him, that he'd tried to warn people and been pathologized for it, that I could have prevented it by reporting the signal the first time I detected it. All of that was true, but saying it would only turn attention toward me, and I couldn't risk that. The signal was still teaching me, I was still learning, and whatever was coming, whatever the countdown in that rhythm was measuring, was getting closer. The frequency of the signal increased. After that, it came through every few days, then every day, then multiple times per day. It was getting stronger, clearer, more present. The words were forming complete sentences now, though in a language I still couldn't consciously translate. But my unconscious understood it. My dreams understood it. And slowly, gradually, I was bringing that understanding into my waking mind, pulling it up from whatever place the signal was writing to inside my brain. The message was simple in the end, so simple it was almost disappointing. The signal was a beacon, a marker, a claim. Something was coming through, something vast and old and utterly alien was crossing from its space into ours, using frequencies we couldn't fully perceive as a bridge, using minds like mine as anchors. The deep space patrol route we'd been assigned wasn't random. We'd been sent here deliberately, sent to this exact region of empty space at this exact time, because someone in Imperial command knew something was here and wanted a military asset in position when it arrived. Not to fight it. You can't fight something that exists partially outside your dimensional framework, but to witness it, to record it, to establish first contact. I don't know how I knew this. The signal didn't state it explicitly, but as the days passed and the transmissions continued, the knowledge accumulated inside me like sediment, building up in layers until it formed a coherent picture. And with that picture came a realization that should have terrified me but instead felt inevitable. I'd been selected long before I detected the signal. Something about me, something about my neural configuration or my genetic makeup or maybe just the random quantum fluctuations in my brain chemistry had made me receptive. The signal hadn't found me by accident. It had been searching, scanning, testing minds across the crew until it located the one that could hear it clearly, me. And once it found me, it had begun the process of preparation, of transformation, of turning me into whatever I needed to be to serve as the contact point when the intersection occurred. I started avoiding people entirely. I'd go from my bunk to the signals room to my bunk again, speaking to no one, eating rations in my quarters instead of the mess hall. The isolation should have bothered me, but it didn't. I was never really alone. The signal was always there, humming at the edge of perception, speaking its alien words, counting down its rhythm. And sometimes I could feel the presence behind the signal, the vast intelligence that was transmitting, patient and cold and utterly focused on the task of crossing over into our reality. It wasn't hostile, I didn't think, but it also wasn't friendly. It was indifferent to us the way we might be indifferent to bacteria, aware of our existence only to the extent that we were useful for its purposes. The final transmission came on day 72 of the patrol. I was on shift, alone in the signals room by then because they'd stopped assigning anyone to work with me after Lieutenant Corinth had noted in my file that I was displaying antisocial tendencies and recommending psychological evaluation. The evaluation was scheduled for the next week, which meant I had maybe 6 days before they pulled me from active duty and started asking questions I couldn't answer. But it didn't matter because the countdown was finishing, and what was coming was almost here. The signal came through at 0247 hours. It was so strong it overloaded the speakers, creating feedback that screamed through the signals room. Every display lit up simultaneously. Every frequency band showed the same transmission, the same 2.7 exahertz carrier, but somehow spreading across the entire spectrum, as if the signal was no longer constrained by normal electromagnetic principles. I put the headset on and heard it fully for the first time, without interference, without distortion, without any barrier between the source and my perception. The words resolved into meaning, the language became comprehensible, and what it said was this: "We are crossing. Prepare the bridge. Open the channel. Become the door." I understood then what I was supposed to do. The signal had been the preparation, the gradual alteration of my neural patterns to create a specific configuration. Now I was that configuration. I was the bridge, the channel, the door. My mind had been shaped into a receiver and a transmitter, capable of handling information that normal human consciousness couldn't process, and all I had to do was fully open myself to the signal. Remove all resistance, all filters, all barriers between me and the transmission. All I had to do was let it completely in. So I did. I don't remember the process clearly. Memory becomes unreliable when you're interfacing with something that exists outside normal space-time. What I remember is sound becoming something more than sound, becoming a physical presence that filled not just my ears but my entire body, every cell vibrating with frequencies that rewrote them as they passed through. I remember the signals room disappearing, or maybe expanding, or maybe rotating through dimensions I couldn't visualize. I remember seeing colors that don't exist in our spectrum, hearing harmonics that don't fit into our physics, tasting the metallic emptiness of the space between stars. I remember my sense of self dissolving, my identity spreading out across the signal like ink in water, becoming part of something larger and stranger and incomprehensibly vast. And I remember the moment of intersection when whatever was crossing finally arrived, finally manifested in our reality, using my consciousness as the anchor point, the entry wound, the door. I remember the presence flooding through me, so enormous that my mind couldn't hold it, could only channel it, funneling it from wherever it came from into the physical space around the relentless. I remember screaming or trying to scream, but my voice was lost in the sound of the signal, which was no longer coming from outside, but from inside, from me, from the place where my mind had been and now was something else. The intersection lasted 17 seconds. The official report says that at 0247 hours, on day 72 of the patrol, the ISD Relentless experienced a catastrophic sensor malfunction affecting all detection and communication systems simultaneously. The ship's computers registered impossible readings: spatial distortions, gravity fluctuations, electromagnetic phenomena that violated known physics. Several crew members reported auditory and visual hallucinations. 3 personnel were found unconscious at their stations. One of them was me. When I woke up in the medbay, they told me I'd had a seizure, neural activity consistent with severe epileptic episode. I was lucky, they said, that someone had found me before I'd suffered permanent brain damage. They ran tests, brain scans, neurological assessments, psychological evaluations. Everything came back normal, healthy. No sign of seizure activity, No sign of psychological disorder, no sign of anything wrong at all, which confused them because the readings from the signals room had clearly shown me experiencing some kind of medical emergency. But bodies don't lie, and my body was saying I was fine. They kept me in the med bay for a week. During that week, the Relentless completed the patrol route and began the journey back to the nearest sector base. The signals room was shut down for repairs and recalibration after the sensor malfunction. Lieutenant Corinth filed reports. Technicians investigated the equipment. They found nothing wrong, no malfunctions, no damage, no explanation for what had happened. Just like they'd found no explanation for the signal I'd been detecting for 3 months. Some things I learned. Don't leave evidence in forms that Imperial technology can measure. I was cleared for duty and released from the med bay. They assigned me to different duties away from communications, pending further psychological evaluation. I didn't protest. I went where they told me to go, did what they told me to do, behaved exactly as a loyal Imperial crew member should behave. And at night, in my bunk, I'd lie awake and feel the emptiness inside me where something vast had been, where the signal had opened a channel and then used that channel to pour itself through, where I'd been turned into a door and flung wide to admit something that should never have entered our reality. The signal is gone now. I don't hear it anymore. The channel is closed, or maybe exhausted, or maybe just dormant waiting for the next intersection. I don't have the dreams anymore. I don't feel that presence watching me from the darkness between stars. I'm just myself again, or what's left of myself, or what was rebuilt from whatever pieces remained after being used as a conduit for something that exists outside our dimensional framework. But sometimes when the ship is quiet and I'm alone, I can still feel it. Not the signal itself, but the memory of it, the shape it carved into my consciousness. And I know that what came through is still here, somewhere, somehow, existing in the margins of our reality that we don't have senses to perceive. It came through me, and I let it, and now it's here, and there's nothing I can do about that. Nothing anyone can do about that. I'm recording this because I need someone to know what happened. The official reports will say it was a sensor malfunction and a medical emergency, unrelated events that coincidentally occurred simultaneously. They'll classify it and file it away and forget about it, because that's what the Empire does with things it can't explain or control. But I was there. I heard the signal that was never meant to be heard, and I opened the door that was never meant to be opened, and I let something through that was never meant to be here. And here's the thing that keeps me awake now, the thing that makes my chest tight and my hands shake. When I think about it too long, the signal is still transmitting. Not to me, not anymore. But somewhere on this ship, maybe in the communications array, maybe in the computer cores, maybe in the minds of other crew members who heard it during that final intersection. The signal is still present, still working, still preparing. Preparing what? For what? I don't know. But whatever crossed through me was just the beginning. It was a scout or a seed, or maybe just a message saying that the crossing was possible, that the bridge worked, that more could follow. There are 47,000 personnel on a star destroyer. We're heading back to Imperial space, to ports with millions of inhabitants, to a network of worlds and stations and ships that connects across the entire Empire. And somewhere on this vessel is a signal that can't be detected by our instruments, speaking in frequencies we can't fully perceive, looking for minds configured to receive it, preparing for the next intersection. I was the first door. I won't be the last. And every time I pass someone in the corridors, every time I sit in the mess hall and hear the conversations around me, every time I stand in formation for inspection and look at the rows of crew members in their perfect uniforms maintaining perfect discipline, I wonder, who's hearing it now? Who's being prepared? Who's going to be the next bridge when the signal returns and something else decides to cross over? The answer is, I don't know. And that not knowing is worse than anything the signal showed me, because at least when I was connected to it, I understood what was happening. Now I'm just waiting, watching, listening for any sign that it's starting again, that the beacon has activated in someone else's mind, that the countdown has restarted toward another intersection. I have maybe 3 days before the psychological evaluation that will determine whether I'm fit for continued service. The evaluators will ask me questions about stress and isolation and coping mechanisms. I'll give them the answers they want to hear. I'll be calm and rational and demonstrate appropriate emotional responses, and they'll clear me because all their tests and scans say there's nothing wrong with me, and the Empire can't afford to discharge personnel based on events it can't explain. So I'll stay on the Relentless, or maybe I'll be transferred to another ship, or maybe I'll be assigned to a station somewhere. And wherever I go, I'll carry with me the knowledge of what I did and what I allowed, and what is now spreading through Imperial space like a virus, wearing the frequency of sound. This recording is all I have. This testimony, this confession, I'm hiding it in the infrastructure where maybe someone will find it someday, someone who needs to know what really happened, someone who might be able to stop what's coming or at least understand it. The file is encrypted with a code I made up, stored in a buffer that isn't logged anywhere official. It will probably be deleted during the next system maintenance cycle. Or maybe it won't. Maybe it will stay hidden in the computer core, waiting, just like the signal is waiting, just like whatever came through me is waiting. Maybe you're the one who finds this. Maybe you're reading these words years from now, or decades, trying to understand what happened when signals started appearing across the Imperial communications network. Signals on impossible frequencies that turned listeners into doors. If so, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I heard it first and didn't stop it. I'm sorry I opened when I should have stayed closed. I'm sorry I chose understanding over safety, and in doing so, let something through that should have stayed outside forever. The signal that was never meant to be heard has been heard. The door that was never meant to open has been opened. And what came through is here now, patient and cold and utterly alien, spreading through the infrastructure of the Empire like roots through stone, waiting for whatever comes next. I don't know what comes next. I hope I never find out. But I suspect I will, because doors don't close once they've been opened, and channels don't seal once they've been carved. And I'll always be the first bridge, the first intersection point, the first human consciousness that was used to let something else into our reality. The Empire will probably classify me eventually. They'll notice the gaps in my service record, the incident that can't be explained, the way my psychological profile doesn't quite match what someone who experienced what I experienced should look like. They'll pull me aside quietly and ask me questions I can't answer truthfully, and then they'll disappear me into whatever black site they use for personnel who know too much about things that officially don't exist. Maybe I'll end up in a facility on Mustafar or in the deep levels of Coruscant, or just spaced from an airlock like Ensign Delic. My death recorded as a tragic accident or a treasonous defection, or maybe nothing at all. I think I'd prefer that to what's actually going to happen, which is that I'll continue serving, continue living, continue waiting for the signal to return, continue wondering every day who else is hearing it now, who else is being prepared, what the next intersection will bring through, and where and when. The not knowing is worse than death. The waiting is worse than ending. The guilt is worse than punishment. So I'm recording this as a warning and a confession and a plea for understanding that I know I don't deserve. I heard the secret Imperial signal that was never meant to be heard, and in hearing it, I became the conduit for something that should never have entered our universe. And now it's here, spreading silently through the Empire's communications infrastructure, through the minds of personnel stationed in empty space, through the frequencies that connect every ship and station and world. The signal is still transmitting, always transmitting, forever transmitting, and somewhere, someone else is putting on a headset and routing an anomalous frequency to their monitoring station and hearing those tones cycling through their sequence and that rhythm pulsing underneath, and those words that aren't quite words beginning to make sense. I was the first, I won't be the last. And whatever is crossing through us, using us as doors, building its bridges from our consciousness, is patient and vast and utterly unstoppable by anything we understand as power or force or resistance. This is Communications Specialist Third Class Varentalde, ISD Relentless, recording for anyone who finds this. The door has been opened. What came through cannot be sent back, and the signal is still calling, still searching, still preparing for the next intersection. I wish I'd never heard it. I wish I'd reported it immediately. I wish I'd died before I could become what I became. But wishes don't change what is. The signal that was never meant to be heard has been heard, and we are all